Storage space comes at a premium in a small shop like mine, and I'm running pretty low. So today I'm going to use some scrap to get me across the finish line. Let's just hope we don't have another crash. So as I mentioned in the opening, today I'll be adding some additional storage to the shop. But I have a ton of excess sheet goods, so I plan to use those scrap pieces to build a unique and elevated storage solution. Now, I know a lot of people are going to be surprised that I have a lot of extra Baltic birch laying around, but when you're building a lot of cabinetry, you tend to accumulate a lot of scraps. And these scraps in particular are pretty old, and are probably from the first few cabinets I actually built for the shop. Which is good, because building cabinets from Baltic birch today will do a number on your wallet. Before we get too far ahead of ourselves though, let me explain why I need to add additional storage to the shop. As some of you may know, I had a somewhat catastrophic accident during my last Lego dresser build. A mason jar filled with tannic acid fell from the top shelf of my current storage solution and exploded on the ground. The splash nailed the side of my cabinet carcass and left dark stains across two faces. Unfortunately, at that point, I was unironically already onto the finishing step of the project, so I had to take a couple hours to remove the tannins from the surface using some barkeeper's friend. Anyway, long story short, it sucked, and I decided I needed a more enclosed storage area for my finishes and finishing accoutrements. This way, I could avoid any more Titanic-sized catastrophes. Now that I've destroyed that French pronunciation and we're all caught up, let's hop back into things. What you see me doing here is just cutting down my carcass parts. But because I'm using scrap, I needed to extend the width on my vertical partition panel, which is what you saw me gluing up a moment ago. Normally I wouldn't recommend edge gluing plywood, but in the case of this center support panel where I only needed an extra inch, it should be fine. So once I had all my parts ripped down to final width, I could go ahead and cut them down to their final length, and to do that, I'm just going to use my crosscut sled. With all my parts trimmed down, I can next lay out the dados for the vertical partition. In the past, I've built a lot of shop cabinets using pocket screw joinery, which works great, but today I wanted to step things up and show off some different techniques. I firmly believe in trying to surround yourself with aspirational work because I think your work environment reflects the craftsman you want to be. So when it comes to shop furniture, I like to have fun. And on that note, this cabinet doesn't have to be a finished cabinet. Really, it's a solution that could be used for any small shop cabinetry. This one in particular will hang over my router table, mainly because that's the only wall space I have left in the shop. So I'm going to build it with inset doors that will open wide enough for my shelves to sit on drawer slides. This way I can reach items in the rear of the cabinet. But more on that later. With my dados marked out and my top and bottom panels clamped together, I use my router to cut in the stopped dados. I've used this technique countless times and always achieve excellent results with perfectly aligned dados. Routing the channels this way ensures that both dado joints are mirrors of one another, so the alignment is spot on. Once I have my initial 1/2 inch by 1/4 inch dado cut, I like to use a router plane to smooth out any uneven areas in the joint. A lot of people omit this step, and as a result, end up with joinery that's not quite as tight as it could be. It's like when you get home from the grocery store and remember what you went there for in the first place. Happens to the best of us. Moving from one dado technique to another, I next installed a 3/4 inch dado stack over at the table saw to cut rabbets into the top and bottom panels. Since this is 18mm thick ply, which is just under 3/4 of an inch, I just use a sacrificial fence and bury my blade a little to make the cut. I also like to take 2 passes over the blade for this process, just in case I have any uneven pressure in my first go. From there I can lower the blade a bit and nudge the fence over to cut the shoulders for my vertical partition tenons. Now I feel it's important to point out that I dialed in the fit for this joint off camera on a test piece, and the fit I'm going for is slightly too snug for my 1/2 inch dado. This way I can take my workpiece over to the bench and clean up those shoulders with a shoulder plane. Working this way ensures the tightest fit possible, as dialing in the perfect fit right off the table saw can be kinda tricky. Better to be too tight than too loose. Over at the bandsaw, I can cut in the shoulder notches for my stopped dado. And since we're here, here's a quick bandsaw thought. Of all the things that taste like chicken, it's weird that eggs are not one of them. Shocking, I know. Back at the bench, I used a pole saw to chop off the excess waste from the notch, then cleaned up the joint with a chisel. Just remember when you're notching out your tenon parts to give yourself about a 1/4 inch more than the overall length of your dado. This is to compensate for that curved part of your router bit. If not, your joint won't be concealed and a smidgen of that dado may poke through. So overall, we're looking for about a 1/2 inch of overlap, just like that. With the Dados wrapped up, it was time to move on to the Carcass Rabbets. There are quite a few ways to hang cabinets in your shop, but I lean towards mounting my cabinets via the rear panel. To do that, you need to give yourself a pretty deep rabbet around the rear of your case, and in this case, no pun intended, that's going to be a 1/2 inch by 7/16. Now, with that in mind, I also need to consider which parts to rabbet all the way through and which parts to stop on. So I'll go all the way through on my sides and make stops on my top and bottom panels. To make those cuts, I just mark the start and stop points of my blade on my fence, and then ease my workpiece into the blade, kind of like a router table. Here, I just want to make sure I keep downward pressure on my workpiece the entire time so it doesn't kick back. So I'll make the cut, shut the saw off, wait for the blade to stop, and lift up the workpiece. And hey, if you dig tips like that, make sure you like and subscribe. It really helps the video out, and I greatly appreciate your support. From there, I can lay out and mark the location for my fasteners on the top and bottom panels of the cabinet. To do that, I'll use a few squares, a pencil, and an awl. I like using an awl because I can just quickly sand away my pencil marks while keeping my indicator points still visible. It also gives me a place to pop my drill bit during the assembly process. Once I have the rabbets all marked out, I follow the same procedure for my center dado. Now we're on to the glue up and assembly of the Carcass. As I mentioned earlier, I'm going to use both glue and screws to hold the cabinet together. Usually I'm not a huge fan of mechanical fasteners, with the exception of pin nails, but when it comes to shop cabinets, I think it's important to make sure they don't fall apart. So while I do believe glue alone is strong enough to do the job, I just like to double down with screws so there's no doubt. Just like when I took that leap of faith. I had no doubts, but there was plenty of gravity. After about 45 minutes of letting the glue cure, I could move on to finishing those rabbets I had talked about earlier. Since I already removed the bulk of the material at the table saw, all I have to worry about are the corners. So I'm just going to use a rabbeting bit with an adjustable bearing to match my existing cut. I think the trickiest part about this procedure is just making sure that I hold the router vertically and take shallow passes. And the bit's pretty chunky, so I want to take my time with the cut. But since the cylinder can't go in the square hole, I'll have to finish the corners with my chisel. And this is how I can seal that rear panel without having exposed corners. I'll also say that plywood isn't the easiest material to work with as far as chisels go, so make sure you sharpen those can openers beforehand. With the rabbets cleaned up, it's time to move on to that rear panel. So I'll first take my measurements directly off the interior of the rabbet. I like to do this by first marking the overall length of my rule, and then measuring the distance between the mark and the edge of my rabbet. This is a quick way to get dead-on measurements for larger interior parts. Next, I can head over to the assembly table and mark out my sheet. Since this is a larger piece, I'm just going to use my guide rail and a track saw to cut it down. Again, I can hear some of you in the comments saying, how can you have a full sheet of plywood as scrap? Well, first, it's not a full sheet of plywood, and second, I'm a lumber hoarder. A lot of woodworkers are, it's okay to admit it. So while we're coming clean, let me know down in the comments if you're a lumber hoarder like me, or if you just toss your scraps. If you tend to keep a lot of your offcuts, comment hoarder, and if you throw them out, comment tosser. As always, if you start your comment with hoarder or tosser, I'll reply to you first because I know you're paying attention. To attach the panel, I applied some glue to the rabbet and drove a screw in every 6 inches. Next, it was time to break through to the doors. So once I had my interior measurements, I just subtracted 1/8 of an inch from my reveal gaps from the top and bottom of the doors, then I could cut down my panels. When it comes to the width of the doors, I subtract 3/16 to compensate for the gap at the center between the two doors. And just like that, we have a pair of doors that even Jim Morrison would be proud of. Though I do wish they came off the same panel so that we had a continuous grain pattern. Again, scrap wood. From there, it's on to the hinges. And for this cabinet to function properly, I needed to choose a set of hinges that would open fairly wide. This way, I have plenty of space for my drawer shelves. Or are they shelf drawers? I don't know. So I decided to go with European style hinges that would open at 170 degrees to give me a lot of room. When it comes to mortising out the cups, I have a jig I picked up a few years ago that works great for a quick one-off solution. If I were going to do 3 or more doors, I'd probably do them over at the drill press, but this one does perfectly fine. I'll leave a link to it down in the description for anyone who wants to check it out. Once the mortises are plunged, I'll just use a double square to make sure that my hinges are aligned with the edge of my door, then a self-centering drill bit to pop in a pair of pilot holes before driving in my screws. Yeah, these work a lot better than that crazy doorman. He was completely unhinged. So with my poor hinge humor hitting an all-time high, I could install the mounting plates. To do that, I'll again use a jig, but one I've modified. There are a lot of different jigs out there for installing these mounting plates, but I just make slight adjustments to one, moving my stop in or out with some two-sided tape depending on the type of hinge. All that's left to do now is attach the doors and make any small adjustments needed for them to sit even and flush. Yep, I'd say that'll work just fine. When it comes to pulls for my shop cabinets, I either like rounded pulls so they don't snag on clothes or something very low profile. My current wall hanging cabinets just use a 1.5 inch hole plunged all the way through, so I'm going to do the same thing with this set of doors. I've had a few people ask if I've had issues with sawdust getting into the cabinets, and to be honest, I haven't had any problems with my current setup at all. So if it ain't broke, don't fix it. To punch those through holes, I'll just use a Forstner bit over at the drill press. Next up was to decide where I wanted my sliding shelves to live. I know I have a few larger items I plan to store in the cabinet, so I'm going to be pretty liberal with the vertical spacing. Once I had my height marked out, I could use a drawer slide for reference to cut out a few shims for the outer interior walls. Even though my hinge is open to 170 degrees, there's still a bit of overlap with the door panel. So I need to offset that by about 23/32 of an inch or 18 millimeters, which is the actual thickness of 3/4 inch plywood. I know, decilingual, remember? Over at the table saw, I cut all 4 shims down to their final dimension. Then I could head over to the cabinet to get them installed. I'll just use an offcut trimmed down to the height or length that I need the shims to sit at, and I'll use that to support my work pieces while I glue and screw them in place. I'll also hold on to this offcut, not because I'm a hoarder this time, but rather so I can use it again when it comes time to install the drawer slides. So with my shims locked in, it was time to cut down the pieces for my drawer boxes. And here I'll start with my sides. And once I have those trimmed out, I'll head back over to my case and measure the distance between my 2 slides and then trim out the fronts and backs. I know I called these drawer boxes, and I think that's probably the best way to approach this section, because these essentially are going to be heavy-duty drawer boxes that are inverted for shelves. Sticking with the outer Carcass design, I decided to go with rabbet joinery for the drawer boxes, and that's mostly because I like that look. But when it comes to shop furniture, I would definitely encourage you guys to explore fun joinery techniques. It's always a good idea to test your skills out on projects that aren't showcase pieces, so have some fun with it. When I'm cutting rabbets though, I do like to use my sled along with a stop. This way I can really dial in the width. The hold down clamp also helps ensure that I have an even cut across my joint. But if you don't have a sled, a stop clamp to a miter gauge would work just as well. Just make sure that you hold your workpiece down to the tabletop through the cut. So with the rebates complete, it's on to the grooves for the bottom panels. And since I'm planning on storing quite a bit of weight on these sliding shelves, I'm going to be using 1/2 inch plywood for the drawer bottoms. I also want these to be a rather snug fit, so I'm not leaving much wiggle room inside the groove. And I think it's a good idea to point out that it's fine to do that type of thing with plywood. Since plywood's incredibly stable, you don't really have to worry too much about wood movement. So aim to have a really tight fit on all your parts and don't worry about expansion. With my grooves carved in, I can move on to the drawer bottom panels. I've received questions about how to fit drawer bottoms quite a few times. What I like to do is dry assemble my drawers and then just take measurements across the interior. Since my grooves are a 1/4 inch deep, I'll just add a 1/2 inch to each of those measurements to get to my final panel size. Then it's back over to the table saw to trim them out. Thankfully, one crosscut ended up being the perfect size for all 4 bottoms. That almost never happens. Just like that time my son didn't ask for a snack while I was cooking dinner. Thought we had an emergency on our hands. After a brief checkup, it was on to the glue up. And this goes the same as all drawer boxes, where I just assembled the drawer parts. Since everything is so snug, I don't have to worry about parts going out of 90, and the thicker drawer bottoms make for a really secure reference. Once I've applied a liberal amount of glue to my rabbet and a small amount to my groove, I'll secure the joints with a pair of pen nails. To install the drawer slides, I'm just going to use a scrap piece clamped to the front of my box as reference, and I'll attach the slides while they rest flat on the bench. From there, I'll use a self-centering drill bit to plunge in my pilot holes, then drive in a trio of screws. With one slide attached, I can just rotate the drawer 180 degrees and repeat the process. Securing drawer slides this way is the easiest way to keep them aligned. When it comes to installing them into the case, again I'm going to use that scrap piece I used for the interior supports. Only this time I'll add 2 additional 1/8 inch shims under the reference board. This will raise my reference board enough to center the drawer side mounts on my interior supports. Next I can go ahead and slide in my shelves. Now, just like all drawer slides, it's going to take a little bit of effort the first time they go in, but after that first push, they should be nice and smooth. Once I had my rolling shelves in place, I could go ahead and reattach the doors to make sure they cleared the hinges. And thankfully all that planning worked out because the drawer sat just below the hinge arms. Like when I bought that new planner to get me more organized. Now I just plan ahead to procrastinate. The last step before finish was to sand all my plywood edges. And I find that this attachment for holding my random orbit sander at 90 works great for cleaning up the saw marks. It makes that edge super crisp without rolling things over. With the sanding done, it was on to the finish. And for the finish on this one, I'm just going to use some Rubio monocoat because I have a ton in the shop. But honestly, anything would work for shop furniture, just use what you have on hand. I would just make sure that it's a finish you actually want to look at. So while I finish up the finish, allow me to say thank you to you guys for watching and supporting the channel. I make these videos on nights and weekends, so having the support from you guys really goes a long way. With that being said, if you'd like to support the show further, I'd like to invite you to join my Patreon. There you'll get discount codes on plans and merchandise, an invite to the Discord server where we're constantly talking about woodworking and woodworking projects, plus other behind the scenes access that you just can't get through YouTube. So if that sounds like something that would interest you, check out the link down in the description. And as always, to those of you who have already joined, thank you so much for your continued support. Your donations go directly towards making these videos, so thank you. From there, it was on to attaching the cabinet to the wall. So once I found my studs and installed a reference brace along the bottom of my cabinet, I invited my wife from the shop to help me get it in place. A few pre-drilled screws allow me to secure the cabinet to the wall, and then I can remove the brace and reinstall the shelves and doors. And now all that's left is to fill the cabinet and check out those beauty shots. You know, I gotta say, I'm a sucker for a good shop cabinet build. It's always fun to find unique solutions to common problems. And in my case, that was all spurred on by a crash well before the finish line. Thankfully, this will be a much safer storage area for all my finishing needs. So if you enjoyed this project and you're ready to go on another adventure, check out this video next. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And as always, I knew this would work, and I'll see you next time.